Welcome to the Women's Connection. I'm Barrie-Louise, Switzen, your moderator. Women's Connection is a program about events shaping women's lives and helping one gain authentic power on a personal or professional level. So won't you stay tuned?
For 50 years, you mention her name and people's eyes light up or gloss over. I'm talking about Ayn Rand. I call her Ayn, but I know I'm mispronouncing it. But Ann Heller wrote a biography on her, and we're going to find out more about it. Miss Rand, welcome.
Thank you very much.
What made you decide to write a biography about her after all these years?
I used to be a magazine editor, and while I was working on a new magazine for a large magazine publishing company, somebody I was working with showed me a passage from her great book, Atlas Shrugged. I had always heard that Ayn Rand was a potboiler and a political extremist, and I'd never read her before, but I was so impressed with this passage, which was the money speech from Atlas Shrugged, that I read her books, and then I read what had been written about her, and I realized that there had been no full-scale biography of Ayn Rand, which was crazy given the romance and drama of her life. So I decided to do it.
Was resources easy to come by, and did you have any obstacles trying to get information about her?
The Ayn Rand Institute, an organization devoted to her work, holds her papers. Every biographer wants to get hold of the letters and notes and journals and photographs that exist in the papers of the subject, and I was denied access to those. But I did have lots of resources and lots of information. For one thing, Ayn Rand was a cult figure in the 1950s and 60s, and many of her cult followers are now in their 70s and 80s and even 90s, so I was able to interview them. Also, she was born in the Soviet Union, or in Russia, in 1905, and I was able to do research in the newly opened Russian archives and find out many things about her childhood that had never been known. And I went all over this country looking for her letters in Hollywood and in New York, the places where she mainly lived. And I think I gathered a pretty good portrait of Ayn Rand.
Did you go to Russia? And if you did go to Russia to do the research, were they greeting you with open arms, or were there other challenges to overcome?
I have been to Russia, but not to do this research in the city of St. Petersburg. The Russian archives are not all that long opened. So I hired a team of researchers specializing in Russian archives to go through all the archives from colleges and schools and merchants associations and telephone books to find out everything they could about Rand. And I kept in touch with them by email, miraculous email.
Thank God for the internet these days. If you read her books when you were in your 20s during the 60s and 70s versus today, what do you think would have changed as far as your opinion of her?
I think that it was better that I read her later. I think I would have rejected out of hand her philosophy and her heroes and her literary method when I was younger. I was much more judgmental and tended to dismiss things more quickly than I do now.
She grew up in Russia and then came to America, but she grew up in a very wealthy family that became poor during the Stalin years. When she came to America, she realized what was going on with the advent of communism, and this influenced the way she was thinking and what she was speaking out about. But yet nobody would listen to her until she finally wrote her book. Do you think she had a positive impact or a negative impact on the culture of today?
When Ayn Rand published Atlas Shrugged in 1957, it would seem that communism was not a threat in the United States. But she saw the welfare state and the growing state power that had happened since World War II as a threat saw it as incipient socialism, and she changed a lot of minds with Atlas Shrugged. I think she's still worth reading today because she posits the extreme view of what is the right way to run an economy and run a country. And it gives a pause for thought.
Well, let's go back to her money speech that is so famous. What stands out about it that we can relate to it today? I mean, I think she would probably turn over in her grave if she knew what was going on.
If people say she predicted it in Atlas Shrugged. Atlas Shrugged has become a bestseller again. It sold 500,000 copies last year because everything she said has an eerie echo with what's going on today. The money speech defended money as a means of trading between productive people without violence, without power struggles. It's a neat and clean way to trade. And that was a revelation to me. I thought of money as slightly dirty. And I understand money differently now, and I think everyone who's ever read her does.
Well, money is a good, clean way to barter. It's a different form of bartering.
Well, he said that those who say they dislike money are people who have not earned their money honorably, that people who really earn their money respect it, and it respects them.
Reading her book, well, rather reading her biography that you wrote, it kind of blew my mind apart because she was such a strong-willed woman that anybody who went against her was immediately outcast. But yet, she had a husband who seemed like a doll, and she decided to have an affair with Nathaniel Brandon, and right under his own nose. I mean, she told him and his wife, we're going to have an affair. I mean, I can't believe that. But what made me so shocking was, or rather what made me so surprised and shocking to me was the fact that Frank, her husband, went along with it. Why do you think he went along with it?
Frank was a silent film actor in Hollywood when she met him. They were married approximately 40 years when she decided to have an affair with Nathaniel Brandon. She was 45, he was 21, and Frank O'Connor, a gentle, lovely man by all accounts, agreed to this affair. I think because he had always considered her the important one in the marriage. He knew she was a genius. He knew he had a mission. And even though the affair made him absolutely miserable as time went on, he wanted to be able to give her what she needed, and she wasn't getting what she needed from him in certain ways. He was a very passive man. Nevertheless, it is shocking that Ayn Rand would insist that there would come no harm of such an arrangement when the smallest school child could probably tell you that harm is inevitable in that kind of a relationship.
Well, I was shocked when she broke up, or rather he broke up with her, in the way she reacted. To me, it was like any adult or any person being scorned by the person that they loved or thought that they were madly in love with. And her reaction that you described just kind of blew me away. I mean, it was like a page turner. I couldn't believe this. It just sounded like, here is incredible, brilliant woman who's always talking about the ego and the philosophy of getting ahead and speaking your mind, being rejected, and her reaction. It just was more than I could bear, really, when you think about it.
It's a very sad story. One of the reasons I called my book Ayn Rand and the World She Made is because by the time Nathaniel Brandon and Ayn Rand split up, she had created an alternate universe in which Nathaniel Brandon had to love her. He actually fell in love with a woman who was 23 or 24 years old. Rand was 63, and I think most of us, if we were 63 years old with a 38-year-old lover, would not be terribly surprised that he wanted a younger woman. He told her he wanted a younger woman in endless therapy sessions. She didn't hear it. She lived in a world in which values, how smart you were, how accomplished, what you created in life, were the things that drove attraction, which all of us kind of know isn't true. And she could not change her mind to see that Nathaniel's reality was very different from that.
One of the other players in her life was Albert Ellis. You didn't touch much on him, but it was really funny. I remember reading some books, and he was included to quite an extent. And when I moved to New York, I was walking the streets one day, and I saw the Albert Ellis Institute, and I went in, and I said, oh, I'd like to meet this man, and sure enough, I had a session with him. And after the session, I came out laughing because one of my father's favorite sayings was, you woulda, shoulda, coulda. And I'm sitting there with Albert Ellis saying, addressing, my issues about moving to New York and all the other troubles, adjusting and everything else. And he said, get rid of all those woulda, shoulda, couldas. They're doing you no good. And I walked out of there a few dollars cheaper, less, or lighter, I should say. And I just laughed. I called my father up and I told him, here, this famous man was saying exactly what my dad had been telling me all my life. But what part did Albert Ellis really have in her life?
She and Albert Ellis met only once that I know of, but he certainly had very strong opinions about her. I was lucky enough to be able to interview him in his 90th year before he died. He died last year or the year before, about Ayn Rand. He called her a Nazi and a baby and a crazy person. He was very, and not in that language exactly, he was very earthy man. And he was also a prolific writer, and one year after he had debated with Nathaniel Branden and made Ayn Rand so angry by what he said about her books that she jumped up from the auditorium seats and shook her fist at him. He published a book called Objectivism, Is It a Religion? And he definitely thought that it was. This is at the height of Ayn Rand's cult following, and the auditorium was filled with her fans, and there was just chaos when she stood up and declared that he was slandering her by saying that her characters didn't exist. Don't I exist, she said. It's a very famous scene.
It's like it would make for a great movie. It seems like there was a theme going through the book, that she took a lot of prerogatives that a man would take, especially during her time frame. Today it wouldn't be so unusual, but back then it was extremely, not outstanding, but noticeable. What do you think about that?
I've had much fun with that theme. Ayn Rand came by herself with no relatives to speak of to the United States to pursue a career. She married a man because he was good looking and he looked good on her arm. And she lived by logic alone. She had no time for emotions, she said. And she took a lover when she was a successful woman in her middle years. All of these things are things that men do, and she was in no way defying convention. She just did what she wanted to do, and she lived free of the constraints of a woman in those days. I think that some of the animus against her is because she spoke out very plainly and sometimes harshly as a woman. I wondered what would have happened to her had she been publishing these books as a man. I don't think there would have been all the hubbub and hatred and outrage and devotion and adoration that there was. The fact that she was a woman is was a very interesting thing to me.
She was a very gutsy woman going along the line and trying to get ahead on her terms. She never really was a politician that you would have to be in playing, And I think a lot of people admired her for that, as well as writing the books. And, you know, it's the naysayers who say, oh, you can't do this and you can't do that. But she strove and she got there. And she gave a lot of people a lot of, what would you say, encouragement in her writings, not so much as a person. How do you feel about that?
I couldn't agree with you more about her encouraging many, many people to defy convention and do what they want to do. There's a big Ayn Rand following in Silicon Valley of entrepreneurs who feel that they go against the grain and take big risks, and that she affirms them in that. All throughout writing the biography until Nathaniel Branden became the major issue and preoccupation in her life, I admired her courage enormously. She never said what people expected her to say or what would please people. In the 1930s, when the whole world was behind Franklin Delano Roosevelt, she spoke out against him. She and a few other people, very, very few intellectuals, spoke out against FDR. And whether you think she's right or wrong, and I think she was both, one has to admire the absolute courage of that. She wanted to succeed, but she wanted to succeed absolutely, honestly, and on her own terms. And she succeeded beyond her wildest dreams, and yet she died unhappy, I'm sorry to say. What she did accomplish will live on.
One of the things that made me sad in your biography on her was the way she treated her family. Here they had given her so much and done so much for her. It was as if she was entitled. I guess that's the only way I can describe it. She felt entitled.
When I began to write about Ayn Rand, I really didn't understand that quality in her. She didn't look back. She wasn't grateful. She convinced herself that no one had ever helped Ayn Rand, when many, many people helped Ayn Rand, and I certainly demonstrate that in the book. I believe that her will to do what she did was so strong that she couldn't take the time, not consciously, but unconsciously, to acknowledge the help she got. Her relatives in the United States, in Chicago, who let her stay with them for a few months when she first got here, are the third generation of those relatives are still mad at Rand because she didn't tell them the dire circumstances that her parents were living in St. Petersburg in 1926 during the rise of Stalin. And they would have helped that family. She told them. But she didn't, not because she didn't care, but because she didn't think about anything but her mission.
She grew up in a very comfortable lifestyle in Russia. And then things started to change. How do you feel that this affected her in adult life?
Enormously. She must have been a very intelligent child. Even before the Russian Revolution, which took place when she was 12 years old, she'd made up her mind that Christian religion was a very bad thing, Russian Orthodox religion. When the communists came along and snatched her father's property, he ran a drugstore. She happened to be in the store one day when the Red Soldiers came in, looted the store, shirted it, and wouldn't let her father work there anymore. She began to think about the similarities between Christianity and communism, and she formed her philosophy of anti-altruism, as she called it, that we have a right to exist for ourselves without any duty to others, on the basis of those experiences. She was horrified when she got to the United States and found in 1926 things were wonderful. By 1933, she saw creeping communism in America, and she really believed this country was the last best hope of Earth. Her view of it was probably based on a fictitious 19th century entrepreneurialism, but she sincerely feared that communism was going to ruin this country, and she fought against it. her childhood, she was Jewish, and she grew up in a Jewish family. And I think her outsiderdom, her feeling always that she was an outsider, partially came from living in the most anti-Semitic country in the world at that time and growing up so bright and watching the things that went on around her.
One of the things that amazed me by reading your biography on her was that she developed a cult following. In fact, I was at the health club one day when some guy came by with a t-shirt that said, "Who is John Galt?" Did I pronounce Galt?
Mm-hmm.
Galt. And it was like, whoa, I like this guy. And so we struck up a conversation. What do you think was the main influence for her cult following?
When Atlas Shrugged was published after 14 years of writing it, this loose network of libertarians that already existed read it and were ecstatic about it. The conservatives weren't so happy, William F. Buckley and that crowd. They began to write to her and want to talk to her. She was very open to having people come and talk to her in her apartment in New York. And her lover, Nathaniel Brandon, decided that this should be a movement. And it was named her philosophy, Objectivism. And he who built a kind of formal movement. He held lectures in New York at hotel ballrooms explaining her philosophy, and sent out newsletters and really built brick by brick a movement that not only enriched himself and her a little bit, but sold her books like crazy, which is the main thing she wanted. She wanted people to read her books. So, but the cult was a small thing to begin with. In the 1960s, after she started speaking on college campuses, Brandon began to assemble more people, and he began to demand loyalty from them to her ideas. And she, too, began to demand that people adhere strictly to her ideas. People became both enraptured by her and afraid of her. And this went on for 10 years, and it became a really classic cult, which dispersed when she broke up with Nathaniel Brandon. But I think what they liked about Ayn Rand was that, first of all, she could tell you the reasons for everything. She had a complete worldview, and she was utterly certain about it. And for people who were uncertain, young, they didn't understand why things happened, they didn't want to be like their parents, she held a great attraction, especially for those who were suspicious of the left, which was so powerful in the 1960s. So the people I met who were part of her cult, as I say, they're now in their 80s, sometimes 90s, are very bright people, and it took me a while to figure out why they would want to be part of a cult of any kind, let alone an Ayn Rand cult. And the only explanation for it is that they say they had the best moments of their lives sitting with her and listening to her describe her books and her ideas. She had great charisma, and it's very hard to recreate it without having seen her myself. But the cult started out, I think, with admiration, and it ended in a kind of unpleasant worship of Ayn Rand.
What exactly was her philosophy, if you can summarize it in one sentence?
Ayn Rand summarized it by standing on one leg for the salesman at Random House. She said, metaphysics, existence exists, epistemology, reason, ethics, self-interest, politics, capitalism. That was her philosophy in a nutshell. She believed that what we see is all there is. She was an atheist. She believed that the only way human beings can find out what to do about what is, how to survive and how to thrive, is by the use of reason and logic. She believed that selfishness, that is focusing on one's own reason and one's own logic and trying to satisfy one's own standards by doing things as nobly as you could, was the meaning of life, and that capitalism was the only system that valued the individual. Remember, she came from communism, and she knew that the state was quite capable of treating human beings as objects, and so she was a very extreme individualist. Her philosophy was basically libertarianism, although she would be very angry if somebody told her so.
How did she get her signature pen with the dollar sign? Because I want one.
Nathaniel and Barbara Brandon made a present to her of that dollar sign when she published Atlas Shrugged. She loved the dollar sign because she said she wore the dollar sign in place of a cross, because making money did not involve self-sacrifice or sacrifice of the best within us for people who were less than we were. That's part of the unpleasantness of Ayn Rand.
She didn't want it, she wore it instead of a cross?
Yeah, she said in a Playboy interview that she preferred the dollar sign to a cross because the cross represented sacrificing the best, Jesus, to the worst, the rabble, and the dollar sign represented creating wealth out of the self and the individual, and being able to then spread it to the rest of society.
In closing moments of our show, what would you like to leave the audience with?
The inspiration to not listen to conventional wisdom, and a resolution to read Ayn Rand if you haven't read her. That's one of the reasons I wrote this book, and perhaps to reread Atlas Shrugged if it's been a long time since you read it. Make up your own mind.